welcome to the second video podcast by the Red Fox and Gown, which is me, Renna. Welcome to my new non-cluttered background. It's very exciting. I looked at my last video and I thought, I'll be lucky to have you guys tune in next time because it looked like it was in the middle of such a nest of stuff. So I've reconfigured myself here and hopefully it's a little bit more, less cluttered. Less is more, right? So anyway, today I'd like to talk to you about a couple of different things. One is about the design process for me, because that's something people are really curious about, and I know it's a very sort of individual question. And the other part of what I'd like to talk about is a little mini review of a couple of yarns that I've been using lately. So I'm hoping to have some reviews as an ongoing feature of this video podcast for you. So turning to the first item today, designing. There is no set rules for designing. I hear from people, oh, I always wanted to do that, but I was scared to start, or I'm not good enough, I can't draw a straight line. And really all designing is having an idea and not being afraid to play with that idea, and knowing that the worst thing that's going to happen is that it won't turn out, or it might be the seed of another idea that just evolves and grows. So really, if you just think of it as planting a seed for an idea, it's a lot less scary and daunting. So I've always drawn, as I said last time, and sometimes I've drawn more than others. Lately I had been drawing some small patterns for fashion design, like really beginner type stuff. But it got me into the habit of measuring and wondering about fabrics and drape of fabrics and, whether things are easy to wear. I was really drawn to things that were kind of sculptural. Like I love seeing things in 3D, and I'm a very tactile person, so I like to feel things as part of, seeing how something's going to work and experiment with that fabric. So it was an easy transition to get into designing for knitting for me from that point. So what I start with always, as I said last time, is a sketchbook. So here's my sketchbook. It's kind of overflowing with stuff. I have ideas and sometimes I don't have my sketchbook handy. Don't let that stop you. If you're in the pub, write on a napkin or the back of a calendar or whatever. So I've decided I'll sort of show you a little bit about the process for one of my designs that's out there right now, and that's for the Edinburgh Mittens set. So I'll start backwards kind of for you guys. So here's the mitten. I hope you can see that. I'll put it on even. Pressure of putting on a mitten. Okay. So here's my mitten. Hello everyone. And it's got a little bit of ribbing down here at the cuff, a dark blue, a lighter blue, sort of a medium green, and this is a very pale green at the top. And you can sort of see how it tapers up to the top. And actually the story for this mitten, I had never, well, it started out for a couple of things. One, my nickname is Mitten, or one of my nicknames is Mitten. I don't know how this started, but I thought this mitten needs a mitten, so anyway, bear with me, I know it's weird. So I made this mitten, and I had never actually made a mitten before. I didn't know anything about really making mittens. I knew about knitting in the round, and I had knit fingerless gloves before, and I thought this couldn't be too bad. So going back to my trusty sketchbook, here we go. I started sketching out some ideas, and there they are, the mittens, and I knew I wanted them to have stripes, and I knew there was going to be ribbing, and I start making notes all over the place. And one of the first things I do is I figure out a gauge. I have to early on decide what kind of yarn I want and figure out how many stitches per inch, which isn't super dramatic fun times, but it's kind of a necessary thing. So I don't actually know where my gauge swatch went for this project, which would be really handy, but voila, tape measure. This is the right way up, maybe a bit backwards for you guys. And you can sort of see, like, imagine it's my gauge swatch. I'm measuring how many stitches per inch or metric, over an ideal gauge swatch. And I know everyone's like, oh, gauge swatch, do I have to? It's kind of like, yeah, I do. Gauge swatch ideally is 5 inches by 5 inches or 12.5 by 12.5 centimeters. And the reason being is that you want to actually measure over 4 inches or 10 centimeters what the gauge is, and then divide that by 4 to get your per inch, or by 2.5 to get your gauge swatch. So you know that basically for me, I like inches, so I'll just say stitches per inch. And that is really the basics of beginning to design a garment. So then the really next exciting part is, figuring out the dimensions of an item, right? So because you need to know, how big it's going to be, and then you're going to actually have to do some math. And so math is a little daunting for me. I'm not a mathematician by any stretch of the imagination, and in fact I think I'm a bit dyslexic, which was never diagnosed, and God knows I was shoved into an honors math class in high school, which was like the bane of my existence. And I tried so hard, I took so many notes, and I was one of these people who was always like flipping numbers and putting negatives where there should have been positives, and I'd do stuff, and the mathematician, I think, really math teacher pity passed me so that I wouldn't have to take it again. Oops, we won't talk about that. So anyway, I do have some very basic math skills, which really is all I really need for my knitting projects. So one of the things I had to figure out early on was dimensions. And I don't know if you can kind of see, there's some measurements like length and width, and because people are three-dimensional, you also have to account for three-dimensional space. Luckily with a mitten, like, hands aren't very big, so I figured out what a circumference would be and sort of a length just by measuring. Some people like to go to favorite garments that they have to see some of the dimensions to get a starting point idea. I just sort of wing it, really. That's my secret. And I knew I wanted, I just brainstorm, and sometimes it's just putting notes on paper. Like, I want it to cover my wrists, or I want it to, like, I want wide stripe bands so that, it sort of evolves. And then when I have more details, so I have my gauge and my measurements, colors, I moved on to another sketch. There you go. It's starting to look more like a mitten now. And I jot notes as I start to stitch. I usually have like a rough calculation in mind of, how many stitches I want to cast on based on how many inches that wrist circumference is, and on it goes. And it just sort of, like I said, it evolves. And sometimes, sometimes I don't take as good notes as I should, and sometimes I'm like, oh, this is golden. But anytime, I start with this draft, and then I sort of sit down and type it all up, and check it again, and check my math 3 times, and then I send it to a lovely tech editor who carefully goes over this stuff and, saves me from myself, because I also have the quirk that I'm self-taught knitter, as you know from last time, and so some things that people think are basic aren't actually so basic necessarily to me, or things that they take for granted. So that's really good to get that checked. And sometimes I also have things go to test knitters, especially if it's a bit more of a complicated design, or something that I just would feel better knowing that somebody else other than me has gone through and physically knit the item, to know if there's any problems with the patterns, or if there's anything that could be improved. So it's a real evolution of a process before it actually gets published. So in the end, you end up with a lovely Edinburgh mitten like this, and it covers my wrists quite nicely. It has a nice taper, a good thumb, not too tight, not too loose, And, you know, I have to say I'm pretty happy with these mittens that I've never, you know, had made mittens before. Now I have my own pair, so I'm pretty happy. They're samples, so basically I knit everything at least once to have a sample so that I can, you know, show it to different folks for different reasons, and also to have it as my reference. Sometimes, you know, there's all these supposed rules about samples, like you don't wear your samples, and generally I try not to, but once in a while you just can't help it because they're really too much fun to leave sitting in a box. And it's kind of like my philosophy with, like, when I was a curator at a museum, which is like objects have a life, you know, and, you know, like the hide of First Nations, for example, in Canada's West Coast, believe like totem poles were living objects and they had a life cycle. And then, you know, when they fall, they die. And that's part of the natural process of going back to the earth. And so I also feel that objects in general, you know, they do have a life and then they go. And if I need another one, I can make another one. Hasn't really been an issue. So anyway, that's my little side tangent about anthropology for this session. So I hope that give you a sort of a peek into how I like to design stuff. And I really encourage you, if you have, you know, the desire to try it out, just get a little sketchbook and just start jotting ideas down and sketching things out. And you can also create mood boards, which is another sort of design technique where people go and, I mean, you can rip things out of magazines that inspire you, or take photos of stuff, and you basically make like a collage, or, you know, however you want to do it. Sometimes people do it digitally, and you might have like a PowerPoint sheet filled with different pictures of things that inspire you for that design. So I've done that sometimes too, but like I said, there's no hard and fast way that I come to my designs, but usually it starts with sketching. And I mean, I get inspiration from all sorts of things, from what's happening out in fashion to, you know, something I've seen around the house that I think is cool, or something I've seen on a TV program or out in a walk or whatever. So it, you know, basically my brain is never off for designing. So that's probably a good enough, you know, insight